Okay, couple minutes after 2 or after 1. I got to remember what time zone I'm in. Let me again welcome everyone to this webinar sponsored by the American Sustainable Business Council on COVID-19 and sustainability and why to take a systems approach. The American Sustainable Business Council is the leading business organization serving the public policy interests of responsible companies, their customers, and other stakeholders. Founded in 2009, ASBC membership represents over 200,000 businesses in a wide range of industries. We advocate for policy change and inform business owners, policymakers, and the public about the need and opportunities for building a vibrant, broadly prosperous, and sustainable economy. I'm Thomas Opel. I'm the Executive Vice President of ASBC, and I have the honor today of acting as the host and the introducer for our distinguished panel. First, we have Victoria Keuchel, who's a faculty member in the Global Environmental Politics program in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Keuchel teaches courses such as climate resilient cities, environmental sustainability and global health, as well as practicums on migrants and migration. An architect, urbanist, and native Washingtonian, that's pretty rare. Her practice focuses on concerns of socio-spatial equity and ecological design. She also works for the Cadmus Group, an environmental consultancy, and is an academic fellow affiliated with New York University's Washington, D.C. site. And second, we have Jeffrey Hollander, the CEO, co-founder, and board chair of ASBC. And he is also the co-founder and former CEO of Seventh Generation, which he helped build into a leading natural product brand known for its authenticity, transparency, and progressive business practices, as well as its own advocacy program, which is pretty extensive and very active. Jeffrey is also the founder of Sustain Natural, which develops and markets sustainable feminine care products, and a strategic advisor and former board chair for Greenpeace US. He's currently an adjunct professor of sustainability and social entrepreneurship at the Stearns Business School at New York University, and the author of 7 books, including most recently The Responsibility Revolution: How the Next Generation of Businesses Will Win in Planet Home. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Keuchel. Welcome, Professor, and we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks, Thomas. I encourage members of our audience, if you have questions as we go along, type them in the chat if you would. I'll try to keep an eye on it to monitor it. One of the reasons that I'm here today is that in everything I do, and I'm impressed by your introduction to me, Thomas, thank you. In everything I do, I have tried to incorporate thinking in systems. So what is it? That's one thing that my role is going to focus on today, is talking a little bit about that before we discuss. And then this question of course, how we can employ thinking in systems to get out of some of our more complex problems. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, and how it might be used to produce the change that we need. And then we'll segue to this very interesting question of what can the business community do? What can entrepreneurs do at any scale, individually, collectively, corporately? And also discuss this question of how we know where to make change, which is this idea of leverage points. So you're aware of systems. Certainly if you're working in the business world, you could probably, and I urge you to either do this literally as I talk or think about it in your head. Think of all the systems that you know, the intersecting scales or the nested scales. Some are quite large. You know, the Earth's ecosystem, for example, is a quite large one. Our globalized economic system, quite large. Our health system's very large. You know, down to the system of an individual human body or an individual household. So what is it that characterizes systems? I'd like you to think about it, focusing on two ideas about systems today. One is that what marks a system is this set of interrelationships. The idea of thinking in systems really becomes, in my case, a fairly lifelong process of training my thought to recognize the interrelationships as the essence of our world and its problems, instead of just focusing on one isolated component in a collection of material things. And that's been a transformation in the way I think, because I'm an architect. I'm very concerned with things and materiality, but being able to reconceive of even architecture, even the built environment, as first and foremost a web of relationships, very important. So the example that I always use with my students, because everybody's concerned with their own health, is the individual body. And, you know, especially because we're talking in these days of pandemics, it's also very interesting, this question of, we know that a force like coronavirus, when it enters the body, will impact the body in a systemic way. It's not just your lungs. It turns out it's your heart, it's your other organs. If you think about diagnostic medicine, certainly if a patient comes to a doctor with a sore leg, the doctor wouldn't immediately write a prescription for opioids, hopefully, but would inquire further, probably in a systems fashion, thinking about, is this result of a painful leg some form of perverse interaction of the system? Is it vascular and spinal and muscular? And is it psychological? Is it caused by some external life circumstance? So if you address a symptom like that in terms of systems thinking, really what you're doing is thinking about a solution that is longer term, because you are thinking about these relationships. If you, again, go back to this question of, well, why do we have an opioid epidemic, for example? It could be that it's the failure really to think in systems. So here I want to just raise a flag for you that in your practice and in starting with systems thinking, every time you hear someone say, the problem is XYZ, question that, pause for a minute. In the case of, for example, opioids, you know, the problem is pain. The way to eliminate pain is to prescribe a drug. And therefore, the pain will be gone if I prescribe the drug and it's taken. And in fact, we know now that this failure to think in systems terms, in the case of something like the opioid epidemic, has in fact intensified this problem, created a much, much bigger and in fact more intensified problem. So this is where systems thinking can deal with this kind of complexity. And the kind of thing that we talk about in the School of International Service as being a wicked problem. A wicked problem being something that is complex. When you change some aspect of what you're dealing with, of an issue, it also alters everything else. So you're really dealing in effect with the world as it is if you're thinking about systems thinking. Attribute 2 that I want you to focus on with systems is this idea that a system itself, every system at whatever scale, has a particular function or purpose. And that makes it recognizable as a system. Certainly we recognize our ecosystem for that reason. We recognize nations as systems or cities. Universities, organizations, businesses, for example. So systems do organize themselves around particular goals, particular functions. And As systems and as these self-organizing, to an extent, entities, they are resilient. They're capable of adapting and responding to events. And they do, as a consequence of that, evolve. They have the power to evolve, for better or for worse, evolve. They evolve in response to this other aspect of, if you mapped this world of systems, the entry of events and external agents. And that's where the two interlinked subjects of our session today come in. Climate change as an external agent, and pandemics, most recently, coronavirus comes in. So again, the question of how systems thinking can help you deal with these events on a more lasting basis is really the point. It's also to recognize that if you're thinking in terms of systems, you're also thinking in ways that allow you to recognize and employ the knowledge of patterns. What might seem like chaos usually is not chaos. There are patterns. I actually don't believe in chaos. I think that you can really look and find something deeper. So let's talk about this occurrence of climate change, this occurrence of coronavirus or pandemics. Much debate about this relationship, yes? You know, how are they related? I think one interesting recognition from systems thinking is that it doesn't take very much thought to realize they have common roots and there are common patterns of systems interrelationships that underlie these and that are at work here and that work to perversely intensify both of these external agents. We know, and it actually with lots of good climate-related reporting, we know that human encroachment on the habitat of other species is one reason for both. One reason certainly for climate change, and one reason that we have zoonotic diseases where they are diseases transferred from animals to people because we encroach on habitat. We certainly have increased and intensified climate change due to habitat encroachment, things like deforestation. One other common pattern that I think we've seen amplified in the time of COVID-19 is the pattern of national politics and a disinclination to cooperate as something that underlies both climate change and its intensification and the occurrence of the frequency of the occurrence of pandemics. Certainly this disinclination to cooperate around information or the sharing of information between nations in terms of, oh, hey, we have uncovered, you know, new easily transmissible disease, for example. Certainly the disinclination to cooperate at a global level on issues of what you can do to forestall more intensified climate change, the failure of that cooperation, and information sharing. Another common root, and this is where you veer into this question of how capitalism and our economic systems need to change assumptions. And that's this definition of growth. Are we in fact, through defining growth in the way that we do, very wealth related? Should we think about some other definition? That certainly underlies climate change and also, I think, pandemics and, you know, transmission. So this question of how and where we intervene to make change is really the last part of what I just want to bring to your attention. What I'm going to do is type in the chat this is Danilo, the link to Danilo Meadows's article, Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System. She was a systems thinker. She's, I think we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of her demise, actually next year. She died at a relatively young age, but she was a very influential thinker. And this essay is, I think, in many respects, a very compelling conceptualization of effectiveness of how to intervene. And that's why I encourage you to read it. What she does is she ranks our whole humanity's range of possible solutions to these wicked problems. And it's in order of effectiveness. So she begins at the bottom. The least effective things are, as it turns out, surprise, surprise, are the ones that we do most frequently. They're changes in constants or numbers or buffers, stocks. It's things like, well, one solution, plant more forests to offset, our increasing CO2. Have tighter pollution standards. Those, as it turns out, are some of the most common things we do, yet the least effective compared to other things, such as speeding up policy and innovation. That's higher on the list. Changing the structure of information flows. Who has access to information, how and when? Tightening essentially not just pollution standards, which is low, but actually setting and efficiency standards for policy. Changing the rules of the system. We're getting higher and higher up. What does that mean? It's doing things that seem as radical as if you have a public transportation system and you're trying to discourage people from using cars, make public transit free. The top 4 ways that Meadows talks about as being the most effective, the 4th is quite timely now. It's basically the idea that we could build and nurture political capacity and power among marginalized groups, and socially diverse groups, people that are, either of different colors than white, women, youth. These are some of the most, traditionally globally marginalized groups. Item 3 on her list in the order of effectiveness is changing the goals of the system. We see that happening in places in response to climate change, like California, where it's not enough to reduce emissions. Eliminate fossil fuels. That's changing the goals of the system. And then 2 and 1 are rare, but 2 is very interesting. It's changing the mindset out of which a system arises. How you do that? When you have, as I daily read in the business pages of various journals, that part of the reason is of our current economic depression is that we don't consume. So the mindset of the system is clearly consumerism. So do we shift that to what? How do we live more within ecological balance? And then the number 1 most effective way to intervene in the system is rare, it is the toughest, and that's the paradigm change. And that could be a whole nother session, but that's something that is definitely at the top of this list. So if you think about the scale of effectiveness, you think about where we mostly intervene, you think about the opportunities that a thinking in systems approach might provide in terms of transforming our world for the better. The question now, and now that I'm about to toss this to Jeffrey, is what do we do as individuals, as small businesses, as big businesses, as entrepreneurs? What actions are possible? Where would we intervene for this necessary change? What does it mean for a future business model, for what is a product? How do you, if you're really thinking in systems, how do you reconceptualize your notion of this thing that is potentially a product? Many really basic questions. And so I look forward to hearing from you, Jeffrey. Please take it away.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks for that great introduction. I'll try not to be repetitive. And we'll focus a little bit on my experience with systems thinking, what we did relative to systems thinking at Seventh Generation, and then focus on a little bit on COVID-19 and sustainability. So let me start, with admitting that while Vicki is a teacher of systems thinking, I'm still consider myself a student of systems thinking. And I've had two wonderful teachers, Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer, who both are at MIT. Otto Scharmer wrote a great book called Theory U. Peter has written a whole bunch of books, but they were in many respects my teachers, and I was lucky to have them. And we were fortunate to be able to integrate many of Peter Senge's students into the work we did at Seventh Generation. So we would often get 5, 6, 7 of his graduate students to spend 3 months with us solving problems that we were facing in our business. So that's a little bit of context. One of the interesting things about systems thinking for me is that if you gave me a magic wand and said, what do you want to do to change the world? I have two different answers. One of them is about full cost accounting, and we're not going to talk about that today. But the other is to integrate system thinking into the way we teach young children starting in first grade. And I think that if young kids understood part of systems thinking that is about things like interrelationships and unintended consequences, if we learned that as children, it would fundamentally alter our behavior, because we wouldn't do many of the things that we do, because we would be able to anticipate what are often the unintended consequences of our actions. So as Vicki said, systems thinking is a very different way of seeing the world, and unfortunately, not the way most people are taught to see the world. We are taught to compartmentalize things and to become specialists and to work within boundaries. And, in a business context, sometimes people will tell you you're drawing outside the line here, rein it in. But what we want to do is we want to get people to draw outside the line and to not rein it in. And we took several years to teach everyone at Seventh Generation systems thinking. And it had a profound impact on our business. And I'll just tell you one story, and it has to do with our sales and our marketing team. And when you think about business and systems, one of the things that many companies face is that the sales team and the marketing team have very different objectives. The sales team is driven to generate sales in the short term, in this quarter or this year, where the marketing team, if you have a good marketing team, is focused on building a brand over many, many years. And that often creates a conflict, because you have two people within the same company with very different objectives who are supposed to work collaboratively. And when you start thinking from a systems perspective, you realize this conflict and you begin to develop solutions that enable them to work together in a much more collaborative and effective way. And I think this is probably not unique to Seventh Generation. Another thing, another story that I came across that really for me drove home how profoundly important systems thinking is was the development of ethanol. And, you know, when ethanol first came on the market, the idea of making energy from corn or vegetables said, wow, what a great thing to do. How wonderful from an environmental perspective to be able to make energy from vegetables instead of petroleum. Well, boy, oh boy, did we get that wrong. We got it wrong for a variety of reasons, just a couple of which I'll share. One is that it turns out that it takes more energy to make ethanol than the ethanol actually generates when it's in its finished form. So yes, that was great. We were using corn, but unfortunately, it took more energy to produce the finished product than the finished product benefited us from an energy perspective. And another was we started sucking up all the corn crops in America. At one point, I think 50% or more of the corn was going into ethanol production. That had, as we talked about earlier, some interesting unintended consequences, like driving food prices up in Mexico. All of a sudden, a whole population of people that depended upon corn for their diet and for their health couldn't afford to buy it. And thousands of children starved as a result of us making ethanol in the United States from corn. And if you're a good systems thinker, you might have been able to anticipate that consequence because you would have looked at the system that ethanol was part of. And it's more than just growing the corn and making the ethanol. It looks at these wider markets in more diverse locations. And you would see that it is a big problem. And as Vicky referred to, we have often created problems for ourselves. I mean, one would think that facing climate change and facing COVID, we've got enough problems to deal with. Well, the lack of systems thinking in our society means that we keep creating new problems and more problems and don't effectively solve the problems that we have. So as you might tell, we are both big proponents of systems thinking, studying systems thinking, and using it. It's interesting. You can use it in your personal life in the way you think about your family. You can use it in your business. It has almost unlimited applications. So to just bring us a little bit more to the matter at hand, COVID-19 and sustainability, some of the thoughts that I have when I think about the relationship between these two from a systems perspective is that had we been operating from more of a systems perspective, we would have been much better at mitigating the risks that we're facing today. We have created a gigantic mess because we haven't anticipated something that was visible on the horizon that we were failing to look at and see. And it was interesting, Mr. Gates from Microsoft recently said that this is nothing, this COVID-19 virus, not that it's not horrible and terrible, but he said, wait till you see what's coming behind it. Now, I don't know whether he was talking about climate change or not, but from my perspective, this is an interesting cycle where we have tons of information, tons of evidence about the terrible things that climate change will bring to our society and our environment. And yet we can't bring ourselves to take appropriate action to mitigate what we know is a certain challenge that lies ahead of us. And it is that failure, in a sense, to connect the dots that makes these challenges so much worse than they might otherwise be. And from a business perspective, this really obviously helps you mitigate risk. It helps you be proactive, but it also can be a competitive advantage for your business if you're able to think from a systems perspective and develop proactive strategies to anticipate these challenges that lie ahead of us. And I think that we also, and I always like to frame it in this fashion. When you think about COVID and you think about climate change, one seems to be a health issue and one seems to be an environmental issue, but that's basically incorrect. They're both environmental issues and they're both health issues, and we have to look at them from a holistic perspective. One of the things that is related to systems thinking is the notion of looking and thinking from a holistic perspective, to look at something from all perspectives, from the outside in and the inside out. And that allows us to see things that we don't otherwise come across. So to dive a little bit deeper into this, COVID, and I didn't mean to minimize the terrible situation that we're in, because in many ways, COVID has made plain many of the aspects of our society and our environment that are our failure to think and act from a systems perspective. And one of the things that we see is that these types of problems tend to fall much harder on certain people than other people. When we think about climate change, you think about a country like Bangladesh, where 50% of that country will perhaps soon be underwater. When you think about climate change and when you think about COVID, unfortunately, those in our society that are less well off, those Black and brown families, are experiencing a startlingly greater negative effect than the rest of our society. And again, from a systems perspective, one of the things that happens when we look at these environmental and social issues is that we see that pollution isn't equal in its distribution. Something like pollution from a systems perspective gets distributed much more to African American and Hispanic citizens than it does to white citizens. Just an interesting data point that even though African Americans make up 13% of our population, startlingly 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. We have designed a system to ensure that certain parts of our society experience the burden of bad health much more so than other parts of our society. So when we hear that certain African-American families are much more likely to get COVID, it's because we've created a system that puts them at a disadvantage before we even begin. They're much more health compromised in many cases because they're living with more pollution. They're living in parts of the country that are more environmentally degraded, and that creates terrible problems. And what do we have to do? What do we have to do to deal with all of these problems that we've been talking about? And what I would say is one of the most important things we need to do is we need to address these problems from a public policy perspective. Public policy, in many ways, is the system, the architect of much of what we're experiencing today. It's the architect of our failure to be prepared for COVID. It's the architect of our failure to be dealing effectively with the oncoming effects and the effects that we already see today of climate change. And not everyone is eager to dive into public policy, but I think it's critical. And at ASBC, that is our sole focus. Our sole focus is to try to think about public policy from a systems perspective and to be proactive in the public policies we advocate for to mitigate these problems and prevent some of these problems, and to, at a minimum, lessen the burden that falls on a small part of the population. And, unfortunately, mostly it has been very large multinational corporations that have spent money on lobbyists. Just the chamber, for example, the US Chamber spends $200 million a year lobbying officials to write public policies that benefit their business financially, in the short term. That is a bad system. That is a system that ensures we'll all get into trouble. We need public policies that look out for the health and well-being of our entire society, not public policies that are designed to benefit a handful of very large multinational companies. And one of the things I would encourage all of you to do is to learn about public policy, learn about the avenues that we have to mitigate these problems. The money that we're investing in research, for example, which is something that is obviously critical when it comes to something like COVID. Today, our businesses in America spend more money buying back their stock to increase their stock price and generate increased profits for their senior management than they do on research and development. How is that possible? How is it possible that in America, large companies are spending this incredible precious resource they have, cash, buying back their own stock to push their stock price up to benefit their shareholders and senior management, instead of making the long-term investments they need to make to ensure that we have solutions to the type of pandemic that we're facing today. And again, we can address that through public policy. Very fortunately, when the US government provided COVID relief to businesses, they stipulated that that money could not be used to buy back their stock. That was one of the few very positive things that made it into the legislation. But this legislation is very, very important. It shapes the way people and businesses behave. And unfortunately, we as individual citizens don't pay often enough attention to this very important issue. And it may feel like something that's too big and unapproachable, but nevertheless, it's critical that we pay attention, that we get involved either through ASBC or some other way to express your concern. And before I drift off into another idea that may be unrelated to everything I've said before, let me pause and see if Mr. Thomas Opel has some questions for Victoria or myself.
Thank you both, Professor Keuchel and Jeffrey. A great conversation. Let me start with the question that I have as I was thinking about this. It is probably unfair to Adam Smith, but it gets represented that capitalism is all about exploiting self-interest in a manner that drives innovation and ultimately prosperity. How do you mix the sort of individual and short-term features of capitalism with a systemic approach, a systems thought approach? It seems to me, Jeffrey, as you were talking, the rationale behind behind businesses spending more to buy back their stock than to spend on R&D is because an investment in R&D is like planting a tree. It's going to be, 5, 10, 20, 40 years down the road. And if I'm the CEO of a company, which you have been and I have not, if I'm the CEO of a company and my compensation is based on profitability, then I'm far more interested in driving short-term profitability than I am long-term branding for the company. So I'm more interested in sales than marketing. How do we, let me start with Jeffrey, since you're the former CEO and have been there. How do we address that apparent conflict?
Well, one thing we have to do is change the incentive structure. So one of the problems is that everything is designed for focusing on very short-term results. So if the CEO's compensation is tied to the average returns they get over a 5 or a 10-year period, they would behave very differently because they would know that getting great profits in the first year and then leaving the company in the third year and turning it over to someone else is not going to do what they want to have done from their compensation perspective. Same with capital gains. We consider 12 months a long-term capital gain, and you get a tax break if you make an investment and you hold it for 12 months. Well, if a long-term capital gain was 10, 15, or 20 years, you would have to hold that investment for 10, 15, or 20 years to get the tax benefit. What we've done is we've created a system that incentivizes short-term thinking and short-term behavior because you can reap all the benefits you want in a very, very compressed time period. We need to change those incentives. Companies need to change them, but we also need to change them legislatively so that we don't have the challenge we have with things like capital gains and senior management compensation.
I totally agree. I mean, you've got to work simultaneously in the markets and in government and policy, and address these in such ways. I mean, Jeffrey, you're talking about this in terms of, as you should, in terms of defining a time frame for success. And, that's, I mean, having a longer one in the ways that you suggest for incentives for CEOs, very important. That could be a great motivator. But yeah, I mean, it may be less, involve less radical reconstitution than we think to get capitalism to move in the right direction. But it will take a lot of people doing it and a more general agreement. And it's going to be tough if again, we talk about this all the time in environmental sustainability circles, the prisoner's dilemma or whatever. I mean, it's tough to get people to move off of their thinking in the right direction if 80% of everybody's doing one thing and 20% the other. So much work to be done. But I mean, I'm also really encouraged by the chat that I'm reading here about everything from right pricing or getting this sort of life cycle cost analysis.
Let me interrupt if I can. We have two people who've very politely raised their hands. So let me, Laura Pearson, I'm going to unmute you and go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thank you. So I recently learned about the long-term stock exchange, which is, I think, still in development, but soon to be launched. And I was wondering if you all were familiar with that, and if so, what you thought about it.
I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like a brilliant idea. One of the things that we've been doing at ASBC is developing a lengthy public policy set of recommendations for creating an economy that works for all. And that's the type of thing that we need to focus on. We need vehicles that allow people to make long-term investments. And, we live in a world where 50% of the stock trades that are made on the exchange electronically, people are holding stocks for a matter of seconds to take advantage of a tenth of a penny of profit. And a long-term stock exchange sounds exactly like what we need to have.
Yeah, I think that sounds amazing too. I am not familiar with it, but you can be sure that after today, I'm going to be doing a lot of looking into it. Sounds interesting. I'd love to know who's behind it.
Sally G, you had a question.
Yeah. I'm from the Lackawanna Coalition, which is a rail riders advocacy group. So how can we make single occupancy vehicles seen as resource intensive and negative as they are, when during the pandemic, people are saying how unsafe public transit is, even though there haven't been any outbreaks associated with public transit? The one study that showed that had flawed methodology, and yet, so any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I totally agree on this point. I mean, certainly we can do so much about cars. It would be a longer term thing. I mean, when Copenhagen set about to become the most bike intensive European capital, I mean, what they did in the 70s in response to the oil crisis was they levied a tax on cars equal to the price of the car. I mean, that would certainly be a wake-up call. But I think doing things like, you're worried about safety, well, here are the stats on how much more likely you are to die in a car accident.
Sure.
And here is the life cycle impact of a single occupancy vehicle versus mass transit. I mean, it's a staggering, if you look at your contribution to carbon emissions, that is staggering. So maybe you can appeal to people's sense of ecological duty.
Right.
Yeah. And one of the other suggestions, and this came up in the chat, and total oversight on my perspective, because putting a price on carbon would probably be the single biggest way that we can deal with some of these challenges. As Gregory said, not charging people for pollution encourages them to pollute because it's cheaper to pollute than it is to prevent that pollution. We need to turn that around. It's a huge priority for ASBC. A central part of our focus on making an economy work for all is to put a price on carbon as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Carbon pricing, yes.
And I'm trying to find in my list here someone who raised their hand, but let me ask you this. I think one of the things that amazed me is, and I thought, COVID has exposed an awful lot. But one of the things it exposed is our complete lack of understanding. We have a health system, we have an economic system, we have an environmental system, and somehow we still haven't figured out that, hey, they impact one another. Exactly.
Sad but true. And the even sadder, I mean, and I know that we're all preaching to the choir here, it sounds like, but from the top of our leadership, there's this idea that everything, all of these, it's a zero-sum game somehow. If we do something for the environment, it negatively impacts the economy. I mean, that to me is also truly unbelievable that there are people in power that still believe that, but there are.
And we have I'm sorry, Jeffrey, did you want to?
No, go ahead, Thomas.
I was going to say we have a question from Janine Whitfield. Janine, please. And I hope I'm not just botching your name.
No, you did great. That's it, Janine Whitfield. Thank you very much. I'm from Detroit, and I happen to be African American. And Jeffrey, I really appreciate the comments that you made because they happen to be very real. The one thing that I felt was perhaps missing from the systematic approach is the mental and psychological health. You can put together all kinds of wonderful dynamic systems, but if we think just about the way the 9 systems in the body work together and harmoniously, we're leaving out that crown jewel, so to speak, and that is the ability or inability of an individual to think in a way that allows them to want to implement these kinds of changes. So that pillar must be included, the mental and psychological help or support for changing our world. And I think COVID has been an amazing wake-up call to that because it's affected the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's powerful. Yeah. And it's true. I mean, our mental health infrastructure is globally, non-existent. It's interesting. I did a practicum with grad students on migration the other year, and we tried to interest one of our organizations that we were, working with to do a focus on mental health infrastructure in one of the most climate intensively impacted cities, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and no interest.
We also, unfortunately, if someone has a broken leg, it's very clear that they've got a health problem. We don't treat things like depression in the same way with the same seriousness, and they can be equally or more debilitating. I'm someone who has suffered from depression my entire life. And it was something that for most of my life I couldn't talk about because I felt like people would judge me in a very negative light. And we, of course, need to make investments financially in taking care of people's mental health. This is hugely exacerbated by COVID and the challenges that mostly women are facing at home. But we have to change our attitude. We have to change the way we think about these things and the way we treat people, because without optimal and healthy mental states, we can't do the things we want to do in society. We can't function the way we want to function. We can't live the way we want to live, and it's as you said, Janine, a huge challenge.
Let me ask this next question. I'll set it up with the predicate that I'm reminded in this question of a character, and I believe it was Thornton Wilder's Our Town play, in which the character is telling a sibling that she's writing a letter, or she had written a letter in class and addressed it in such a way that it was her name, her street address, her town, her state, her country, the world, the solar system, and on through the universe. And obviously, I think, the danger may be, how do you ensure that systems thinking is effectively implemented so that it doesn't backfire and create more issues? And part of that question is, where do you stop? Because obviously, as we've seen, Jeffrey just pointed out the broken leg that has the impact on your psychology, but also has an impact on your family, that has an impact on maybe work, and it just, the ripple effects go on and on. How do you deal with that in a way that says, I'm sort of thinking about this as holistically as I can without making the problem so big that it seems unmanageable?
Definitely a question for Victoria.
I mean, you're talking in part about, thank you so much. You're talking about paralysis in a way, right? I mean, if you're confronted by the enormity of the scale of, or I should say not the enormity of scale, but the complexity of this, how can you act?
Which I think is a question that confronts a lot of people about climate change, and in well-intentioned ways and mal-intentioned ways. For example, well, if India and China aren't going to act, why should we?
So yeah, I mean, Sally just put a chat up saying, think globally, act locally. I mean, that's certainly, one way to begin, is really to think about this in scalar terms. And I mean, part of, what I do in one of my part-time gigs as an environmental consultant is I serve a government local to Washington, D.C. in this region. And there I see them thinking in these terms, addressing this in these terms, where they're starting at what they can control, what they can do as a local government, and then forming alliances, intentional alliances with other local governments. There is a Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So they're trying to then encourage policy, and it's not only policy, it's the purchase of, the aggregated purchase of solar power. It's, how do we combine forces to do this, that, and the other? And then that then scales up their nested scales of action. Then they're looking, and without revealing who they are locally, I will say they're in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So then that goes up to the state level. And then from the state to even a larger kind of regional level. So I think you can break it down by thinking thinking about it in scale terms to make it a little more manageable, while keeping in mind the lessons of systems thinking. I don't know, Jeffrey, come on, weigh in here. What do you think?
You get the last word, Jeffrey.
Yeah, you get the last word.
What we have to focus on is that any systems thinking is better than no systems thinking.
Right.
You are more likely to get a better outcome and mitigate problems by using as much systems thinking as you can. And when it gets to the point that it begins to feel like it's paralyzing you, stop. But we have so far to go that I'm less worried about that than I am about all the people and all the businesses and all the parts of our society that don't even know what systems thinking is.
As you know, I think our response to COVID more than adequately demonstrated
Yes.
in the United States this year. You know, having states pitted against each other, bidding for PPE, et cetera, is just
Crazy.
makes no sense whatsoever, even for the most federalist of federalists. I want to apologize to everyone who's got questions. I think this is a great conversation, and we may have to do this again, given the
Great
response.
questions. I mean, the questions that are coming in are critical and important. And again, I agree, Thomas. Sorry we have so little time to ask them.
Right. I think we will seriously look at doing this again and asking, imposing on the professor's time. I know Jeffrey doesn't mind doing these for us as ASBC. But I want to say thank you to Victoria Keuchel and Jeffrey for their time, and thank you for all of you and taking your time in participating in this, asking such great questions, and I wish we could have gotten to more of you. We will try to do that the next time. I will say, I know everybody was asking this question. We are recording this, and we are posting the recording of this. We'll be posting it on our website. We'll also be making available a link to that recording to everyone who registered for this webinar. So again, on behalf of ASBC and American University and Victoria Keuchel, thank you all, and please be safe and have a great week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.